So folk may be aware that the Catholic Church in Scotland was one of the first faith organisations to seek an independent review of its safeguarding practices. To do this, the McClellan Commission was set up and reported back to the Bishops' Conference in August 2015. And the bishops agreed to all of its recommendations, including the setting up of independent audits. The independent review group. And part of the work was to commission an independent audit of each of the Scottish dioceses. And the Social Care Institute for Excellence started this process in 2019. Because all of these audits were really on the diocese, then this is specifically talking about the recommendations or the questions that were asked of the diocese. So my apologies to all of the religious orders and religious organisations in the room, but there's a lot of key learning and a lot of learning that transfers across to different religious orders and religious organisations as well. The first of the audits were published in January 2020 and the last one just last month. Each of the audits are very full. They all have an introduction. They've got roughly 19 sections, which are presented as themes, and each section has a description, some analysis, and the audit findings. Okay. Following each section, there are questions for the individual diocese to consider. Clearly, we don't have enough time today to go over all of those different 8 audits. So what I've done is I've taken them all together, looked at some of the reoccurring themes that are there and grouped them together to try and just kind of bring together some of the major issues that have been raised for across Scotland. It is these common themes that the presentation will focus on, and due to shortage of time, as I said, I've amalgamated a lot of them. So if you are interested in knowing any more about it, then all 8 audits are on the Bishops' Conference of Scotland website, and each of the dioceses also has their own audit in their own website, so they're really easy to find. Okay. So the first group of themes I'm going to mention is safeguarding leadership and management, both in terms of strategic and operational duties. This includes questions around culture, about training and responsibility, and it included questions about the role of the bishops, the role of parishes, and the role of congregations and priests. So it includes how we need to listen better to survivors' voices, and that's very much a theme that we've been looking at today, and quite rightly a theme of what we should look at in everything that we do in terms of safeguarding. So you'll see in here some of the stuff that Danny actually mentioned in her fabulous presentation as well, about how do we make that absolutely core to everything that we do in safeguarding. So in terms of leadership, it was around building confidence in leadership. It was about how the bishops and the curia own safeguarding and to make it really integrated into everything that we do. There was questions there around governance and accountability, but not only around what we have in place that works right, but what do we have in place when it doesn't work right? What if there's disagreements? How do you handle them? There's a lot of questions around training for groups that support and advise safeguarding practices. And a lot of that will kind of really nicely link in to, I think it was question 2 that the groups did today. So what do we need in terms of training? What are the gaps in terms of training? Also, I mean, certainly for my own diocese, but some of the other dioceses as well, there was some questions around operationally being so busy. What does that actually mean in terms of strategy? Are we so busy dealing with things on a day-to-day basis that we don't actually have an overview of where we want to move forward to? Also, one of the questions, and again, I know it came up in our group when we were talking about gaps, was having safeguarding as a standing item at every meeting across the church. And one of the big questions that came up in our group today was, having that on parish councils. Is the parish safeguarding coordinator a member of the parish council as well? How do we truly integrate things if people aren't, safeguarding isn't at the very heart of it? How do we communicate all of this to survivors and to parishes and to everyone that we come in contact with? And really it's about how do we develop this living and integrated culture of safeguarding across all aspects of the church. And some of that touches very much on what Father Hans was speaking about earlier. One of the next sections that looked at was dealing with the legacy of high profile cases and the need for transparency, the need for reflection and the need for learning. So when we've talked about quality assurance as well, how do we make sure that we learn from what it is that we did in the past? How do we know what we're doing just now is okay if we don't quality assure that as well? And it's also about the balancing the rights of many, many different people. You know, we quite rightly talk often about hearing the voices of survivors, but we don't always talk about hearing the voices and supporting those that have been accused. And we certainly don't often talk about how do we hear parishes, you know, parishes who have been greatly impacted by different situations, particularly in high profile cases, or every time something makes it to the paper, and the impact that has on us individually and on our individual faith. And I think Danny touched really well on that, but how does that impact on me individually? Because if we don't look at how it impacts on us individually, if we don't look at how it impacts on our parish communities, how do we appropriately move forward in this? And how do we appropriately support survivors? If we can't look at ourselves, if we can't look inwards, how do we manage to look outwards? Also importantly, but how do we reach out to survivors? And not just those survivors who have been willing to come forward and to tell us their story and to help us make our parishes safer, but how do we find out, or how do we find ways to reach out to those who don't want anything to do with us because of the pain and the hurt and the abuse that we've caused them as well? So, but how do we then work with other agencies to reach out to survivors as well? And crucially important is how do we support people to heal, particularly survivors, but also parishes and also churches as a whole. The next areas were around the really significant groups that we have in terms of safeguarding. So the Diocesan Safeguarding Advisory Group for each diocese is a group of experts from relevant organisations out with the church who have an overview of what we do and provide us with their skills and expertise to try and get things better. And the Diocesan Risk Assessment Management Team is a group that usually involves clergy and lay experts who advise the bishop on the management of any allegations or for those who pose risk. So, for example, if a registered sex offender wanted to come and worship in a parish. So the audit outlined questions around the links between strategy and operational need, the need for processes to come together, but also the need for channels for disagreement as well. And it outlined finding better ways to ensure two-way communication across the diocese and how best to hear the views of survivors. And that linked in very much with what Lady Ray was talking about at the very beginning, and that need for a good communication strategy. How do we actually talk to each other? How do we get that information out there? And without that information getting out there, how do we actually know what it is that we need to do to better support survivors and support our communities? And making sure that those voices, particularly the voices of survivors, is central to everything that we do. The next section that I've put together is guidance, policies and procedures. So some of the themes that were outlined there was how does each diocese link previously with the National Office and now with the new Standards Agency? What are the gaps? And that again was very much that very first question that we had in our groups. And how do we develop our processes and make them accessible? And also, not just that, what do we do about reviewing them? It's all very well having a lovely manual, you know, but if it just sits on a shelf, if we don't actually look at how is it working, what happens in parishes and parish communities and religious orders, and how do we bring it back again to check that it's working and to review it? But also, how do we make these processes easily understandable and available to survivors as well? How do we get that information out there so people know before they get in touch with us that we might be trustworthy, that we might be able to do something? Because if we don't get that information out there, people aren't going to come to us. And the need for robust and easily accessible complaints processes and whistleblowing. You know, and I think that's been a wee bit of a theme today when we're talking about survivors as well. You know, in the past, we had this one view of what a survivor might look like. You know, I am used to working with survivors. I'm used to working with survivors and all of their different entities, and often really upset, angry people, quite rightly so. So what do we have in place to allow them to tell us what they're angry about and what can we do better? And the need for independent scrutiny as well. Again, a big part of what the new agency was looking at this morning. The next group of questions that I put together is allegations, risk assessment and safe worship plans. So we need to find ways to be better at helping survivors, but also those who are accused, and everyone who is involved in a parish community feels supported, that they're treated equitably, and our processes are open to independent scrutiny. We have to be an organisation that is about working with people who abuse as well as people who have been abused. We need to find ways of safely helping people practice within our parish communities as well. So things like our safe worship plans. What do we need to put in place? What do we need to do to train people? What do we need to do to make people feel comfortable? Perhaps the wrong word, but confident in being able to do that kind of work. The need for restorative approaches for survivors and working alongside survivors to support them. But particularly, I think, when we have that dual role of supporting survivors, but mandatory reporting as well. And I think Danny touched really well on that, about what do we do in those situations when we have a mandatory policy, but that might not help that survivor feel that they've got any choices. So what ways do we develop that to try and make sure that we give as much choice as we can within those mandatory reporting processes? And also around risk assessment, which Francis has touched on. So how we understand that and how we train those who are involved in it at every level. Because as Francis very rightly said, I know that in our diocese, that is the biggest fear for our parish safeguarding coordinators, the thing that they feel the most responsible for and the thing that they feel the most worried about. So we need to be able to equip people who are in those key roles to feel comfortable in using that material. Supporting survivors, I've touched on that throughout this short presentation, but it was obviously an area that the auditors concentrated very clearly on. And it was how to better hear the voices of survivors. And I think sometimes what we do within the Catholic Church in Scotland is talk about survivors as if they're out there, as if they're different from the rest of us. We know 1 in 4 people within Scotland have experienced violence and abuse at some point in their life. So there's a whole range of people, not just in this room, but every aspect of what we do in the church as well. How do we better hear all of those people's voices as well? Have we got fair and equitable treatment for survivors? Is it trauma informed? And again, Danny touched on that. The need to understand what it is that impacts and continues to impact on survivors, the way survivors are likely to experience whatever it is that we do. Also that theological leadership and reaching out to survivors who haven't felt that they've been treated well and those are reluctant to come forward. And also support from other agencies, and also to have a range of different services that might suit people. We're really lucky that we've got the Raphael Counselling Service. We've got a whole range of different things that we might have individually in different dioceses been able to sort of like make contact with. But we need to give people a choice about what it is that they would find useful as well. Safe recruitment, training and support to parishes as well was a big part of the audit, and we've already touched on some of that. You can see how that's going to be coming in terms of the risk assessment as well. But they need to follow legal and appropriate processes for safe recruitment. But not just that, but how do we take action when these aren't followed? And I think that's a really important part that we don't always follow through on. To identify gaps and better support for our parish safeguarding coordinators and others who are involved in safeguarding. To look at developing local safeguarding teams and mechanisms as well. Arrange a training for clergy employees, volunteers, DSAGs and DRAMPs, and that these should be trauma-informed with options for delivery across large geographic areas. And I'm sure that came up a lot in all of the different groups when we were looking at the gaps in training. And also something that we weren't really expecting at the beginning of the audits is how do we move on post-COVID in terms of training, in terms of PVG applications, because lots of parishes understandably couldn't do anything during that period. But as parishes are coming together again and widening and doing other things, noticing how much smaller parish attendance is. We've got an elderly, and I don't mean that in a bad way because you bring hundreds of experience with you, but we've got an older population of volunteers. How do we meet those needs as well? And how do we try and encourage younger people to come through as well? And part of everything that we need to do around quality assurance as well. They need to hear from and include survivors into developing the services and safeguarding. What do we actually do with our parish audits? Are our parish audits the best? Do they ask the right questions? Is the parish audit really just a burden that we need to do in January and then we forget about it the rest of the year? What do we then do with the information that comes from that, our action plans, and how is that analysed What learning do we get from that? What learning do we share? And what independent audit is there of it? Continuing to be open to independent scrutiny as well. Now, that really is a very quick Cook's tour of the independent audits. As I said earlier, you are able to get them on the Bishops' Conference website.